let's talk about sex. Now that I have your attention, let's actually talk about education of a sexual nature. The United States is commonly reported to have some of the worst sex education for high school students in the developed world, while also touting some of the highest teen pregnancy and STD rates. The solution commonly advocated is comprehensive sex education, which is backed up with amazing success stories about low teen pregnancy rates and rates of sexually transmitted infections in European countries who implemented such programs. But what if neither side is giving students the full story? And what if the success that many would say the US is lacking is just another degree of failure? I contend that the current definition of comprehensive sex education is anything but. Rather, it is abstinence plus education in comparison to abstinence only. Thus, I argue that schools across the world ought to implement a new form of sex education. What do I mean by this? Progressive sex education in many countries is seen as education that abstinence is not the only way to avoid teen pregnancy and STDs. It also advocates the use of condoms in addition to accurate information about contraceptives. I argue that this isn't comprehensive because it is a product of sex negativity, or a view of sex that hyper focuses on the negative potential outcomes of it while ignoring the positive. Joan Helmick of the American Journal of Sexuality Education argued in 2009 that progressive sex education isn't really comprehensive because it only shares additional and more accurate information about avoiding the drawbacks of sexual activity. It also focuses on sex education from a patronizing perspective that assumes students are already not sexual beings and ought to stay that way until they are in a committed relationship such as marriage. But the reason most people engage in sex isn't to be safe or have a baby. An article by Megan Bartels of Business Insider in 2010 quotes a study that compiled a list of 237 reasons people have sex. The top 5 reasons listed among participants aged 18 to 52 were feeling attracted to somebody, wanting to feel good and have physical pleasure, and wanting to show affection for another person. Thus, current sex education that is abstinence only or abstinence plus fails to help students learn that some of, if not most, of the important parts of sex and thus is not comprehensive. This is why many sociologists, psychologists, and sexologists are rallying behind a new form of sex education, comprehensive positive sexuality education. For example, Erica R. Kopsel of the American Journal of Sexuality Education writes in 2016 that the most important aspect of this is the integration of pleasure into curriculum. Pleasure, which she defines as, quote, the combination of satisfying stimulation of the body accompanied by psychological feelings of enjoyment, close quote. This definition will help to frame sex not as something kids think adults are afraid of and want to hide them from. Rather, it will help them see what sex should be positive, and thus they are more likely to avoid the kinds of sex that aren't positive. Potential benefits of this type of education include increased likelihood of wearing condoms and increased likelihood of reporting sexual assault. But it is also likely to increase the overall quality of kids' sex lives later in life, which has shown to increase happiness and relationship satisfaction. It could also help reduce gender inequity in sex by not simply focusing on the biologically necessary parts of sex, which privilege male pleasure and orgasm, while staying silent on those topics for women. If listening to me talk so nonchalantly about teaching the pleasures of sexuality to students has made you uncomfortable, recognize that very feeling is likely a product of your own lacking sexuality education and your upbringing in a sex-negative culture. And talking about sex in a normal, healthy, and accepting way, like this video, rather than from a position of fear and shame, is the first step in changing our culture. Thanks, and see you next time.